Hello, I'm Cindy Arenberg-Seltzer, President and CEO of the Children's Services Council of Broward County. Welcome to another episode of Future First, Focus on Broward's Children. Since the CSC and other community partners began addressing the underlying causes of institutional racism to more effectively invest resources to improve the lives of Broward's children, we have also endeavored to understand the historical dimension of racism and race relations at the global, and more importantly for us, at the local levels. For hundreds of years, much of the infrastructure upon which our nation was built relied for its growth on the enslavement of human beings kidnapped from Africa. Throughout our history and to the present, laws that have openly or de facto enabled segregation and intimidation based on race have continued to create barriers that, to be broken, must be confronted head-on. Through it all, resilience, ingenuity, strength, and the unabated struggle for equality have defined generations of African Americans who have not allowed racism to define their history, goals, and achievements. This part of the story must also be shared widely. That's why I'm excited today to have as my guests David Watkins, Director of the Department of Equity and Diversity for Broward County Public Schools, Lorraine Mizell, a scion of one of the most important African American families in Broward County's history, and Shaba Kojo, President of Shule, Inc., and a proponent of African narrative-centered academics. Later, we'll hear from several students who recently participated in the CSC-funded Racial Equity Institute summer workshops at the Old Dillard Museum. Welcome. Thank you all so much for being here today.
Thank you.
Mrs. Mizell, I want to start with you because you are a scion of one of the most important families in the history of Broward, and I'm not sure everybody really understands all the contributions that your family has made. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, I'm going to start at the beginning with my grandfather, Isidore Mizell. He moved from North Florida, 1910, circa, I'll say. My father was born in 1911. But when he moved here, he didn't bring my father then because my grandmother was pregnant. But eventually, the three members of the family, which is Dr. Mizell was the firstborn, my daddy was secondborn, and they had 14 children right there in Dania, Florida.
Wow.
And he came as a farmer, but later he began to build because he was, you might say, a contractor, bootleg. And he built a lot of homes and for people in Dania area. So he became a landlord as well as a gardener or farmer. When my father was growing up, the schooling only went as far as 7th or 8th grade. And if they wanted to complete high school, my grandfather sent my father, Aunt Ethel, she was an educator here, and Dr. Mizell, they all went up North Florida to Florida Memorial to graduate from high school. Mm-hmm. And they graduated, and from there, Morehouse. But it was a struggle because during that time, kids were not made, I don't guess, but school was let out early. They could only go to 8th or 9th because they had to pick beans. Did you know that? So school was turned out for African Americans, but it continued for whites, so that they were able to, I guess, assist their parents in picking the beans, or maybe assist the owners of the groves, I suppose. I don't know if you are aware that Dr. Walker, he was the first principal of Dillard Elementary. Mm-hmm. He was very instrumental in stopping that practice of school turnout or school discontinuation for kids, for African American kids. So that practice stopped back in the mid-40s. Wow. Due to Dr. Walker's involvement. But my uncle, Dr. Mizell, he was an activist. You know, he was determined. You said no, he said why not? Mm-hmm. And when he finished medical school, he came here to set up his practice. My father went on to Morehouse, but he went in another direction, business direction, and he came back also to Fort Lauderdale, not Dania. Dr. Mizell, as I said, was an activist, and he started the NAACP. He did a lot of things to move the community forward. And I don't know if I should go into the wait-in or not at this time, but if you're interested in knowing about the wait-in, I could.
I
tell
would
you more
love
about
to.
that. 1961, we still didn't have a beach to go to, African Americans, a beach to go to easily. Back in the late 40s, we were allowed to go to Gold Ocean Mile. You could park on the road and you had to go through a lot of sand spurs, hot sand. It was torturous getting to that water, but we would get there. You know where Gold Ocean Mile area is.
Right.
But it was sold back in the late 40s, so we had no beach to go to. So they came up with the idea of the beach over in Dania, which was named Lloyd Beach. It's been changed since. But there was no road to it. You had to get to it by boat. So you would go to the dock, wait for the boat to come, and you get on the boat and go over. So we would catch the ferry over, the boat ferry over. It would come back and forth all day long, picking up and bringing back. Dr. Mizell thought that was not fair, or it wasn't an easy thing for us to wait on a boat. And why should we do that when there was the beach right there on A1A? You just drive up there and walk in the sand and go. But then we weren't allowed to go to A1A's beach. So he petitioned the courts, he made a fuss, and they still ignored. He said, build a road over there. If you build a road, maybe we'll stop being annoying about going to this beach on A1A. But they didn't. So in 1961, when I was in college, my sister, myself, 2 other college friends, Dr. Mizell came by and picked us up, put us in his car, and said, we're going to the beach. And I said, ooh, going to the beach, okay. And then he drove up to A1A and said, get out. Boy, our eyes bucked. You know, get out here, yes, and get in the water. We had never been in that water. So we all got in the water. That was 4 college students. And that was the first wade in. And he did that because they would not build that road, and he thought he had to make them, you know, build that road. And from there, it spurred on until we were allowed to go to the beach a couple of years later. But we had several wade-ins after that first one.
You know, that's a great example, both of those stories, of things we take for granted today and why it's so important for those stories to be told. If you don't understand your history, you don't value those rights, the ability to go to the beach, the ability to stay in school until 12th grade and go on to college. People actually fought for those rights, and thank you for your bravery in that. That
Well, I
had to
didn't
be
even
pretty
mention
scary.
when we got in the water the reaction, but everybody knows what the reaction was. They ran out of the water.
So sad.
But, yes.
So David, you were part of, I think you participated in the Racial Equity Institute training of the students, and so
Yes.
you can speak to how shocked they were to witness, to learn of their history. And
I think it's very important to know how important it is for both children and educators to know the local history of Broward County, because when educators and children understand their local history, they can better support each other as a community. Many of our educators are not necessarily from Broward County or even South Florida, and it's important to understand the community that they're teaching in and they're serving. So, you know, when I think about Broward County and we talk about this racial equity experience, we talk about Addix High School, which many of our educators know as Addix Middle, but Addix High School was one of our historically African-American high schools that closed, that impacted the West Park and Black communities in the Hallandale Beach area. We talk about Blanche Ely High School, which is a historically African-American high school that also closed at one point. We also talk about Dillard High School, which is also one of our 3 African-American historical high schools. And so there was a time in Broward's history where no matter where you lived in Broward County, you had to go to Dillard High School, and however you got there. Dillard at one point only went up to the 10th grade. It was only open from October to April. And so in order to graduate from Dillard High School at one time, you had to travel, as Ms. Mizell shared, you had to go to Florida A&M, Bethune-Cookman, or Florida Memorial, which at that time was located near Jacksonville. And so having an understanding on how those experiences shape our community today, how they had to fight to make sure that Dillard was a comprehensive K to 12th grade graduating high school, how they had to reopen Blanche Ely as a high school, and how they were going to use, continue the legacy of Addicts High School by keeping it open as a middle school. Those are important lessons to learn for the community, and it helps the educators understand the type of engagement that they experience from the families in those communities.
I know Sue Gallagher from my office has been doing research and going around training on a lot of aspects of Black history in Broward County. And when you see it laid out like that, and as you just pointed out, light bulbs do go on about relationships to certain things. There's a problem with drowning of African Americans, especially children, because they never learned, their parents were afraid to swim, so they weren't teaching their children how to swim. And when I read of the history of, access to the beaches and to the pools, you go, well, no wonder they're afraid. They weren't allowed. So it's not that people don't want their children to live and thrive. It's because they weren't allowed, and it created this thought pattern with the schools. If you weren't allowed to be in school, or you were treated in a substandard way, why are you going to want to come, and why would you see that value for your children?
And when you think about how recent that history is, I've worked with educators who have recently retired, but they started their careers in segregated Broward schools, either as students themselves or as educators. And so when we think about how we can help ensure that the types of things that teachers and students felt, the trauma that they might have experienced by being in a segregated school or having dilapidated or not the same quality of educational opportunities or access to experiences that other students might have gotten, it helps teachers begin and educators begin to understand how they need to change how they engage the community.
So one of the things that was surprising to me, that was a light bulb moment for me when participating in Courageous Conversations a couple of years ago that the school district had sponsored, was I had always viewed desegregating the schools as a positive thing, giving everybody access to the same resources. And then this has really stuck with me about a Black woman educator who said the other side of that was all of the Black educators who lost their jobs. Shaba?
So it's not so much desegregation that was the issue. The issue was integration. And when we view it from that lens, we begin to see it a little differently. So desegregation meant that we had access to go into spaces legally now. So if we wished to have lunch somewhere or we wished to enroll somewhere, we had the freedom to do that. Integration meant, okay, we're going to combine the classes, but we're not going to keep it equitable. So we're going to close the resources in the African communities, and we're going to bus the students into the white communities. Therefore, they're going to now get the white curriculum or the European curriculum. Whereas if we had our own schools and there was equity, then the school budgets would be equal according to, of course, the population or what have you in the areas. But just to understand, firstly, that history begins somewhere. And history for the African doesn't begin in America. History for the African begins on the continent of Africa. So this year, 2019, is the 400-year mark of the first African slaves coming to this continent, coming to North America, particularly Jamestown. And in Ghana this year is the 400-year of the return to Ghana. So I actually had the opportunity to head to Ghana this year, and I sat with an African Nana, which would be equivalent to the king of a particular region. This region being Takoradi and Segundi, historically Esakado. And this is Nana Kobina and Ketsia IV. And he speaks of segregated beaches in Ghana after the Europeans had taken over colonial control of its territory, where Africans were not allowed to be in the beaches, in the water, with the European bathers at that time, and how his uncle, who was Nana during that time, actually did the same thing. They did a wade-in. They did a protest to desegregate, or to rather de-apartheid the beach, if you will. So when we begin to connect the history of African people back to the African continent, we get to see that the narrative is much broader, that there's a world narrative that we're missing. So if we begin to deconstruct our history, starting primarily from the continent, instead of in the middle of our interaction with America, particularly the Ma'afa, or the enslavement of African people, then we have a much broader history. We have a much broader context of what's occurring, not just with the African American experience, but the entire African experience across the globe.
And how would you see that translating into the work that we're doing?
So the issue at the center of African life is family. That's what our value system is based on, right? Strong family. So if we are teaching African American families that their brothers and sisters on the continent had to endure the same thing, now there's no longer that idea of we are two separate people. Therefore, Africans should forever remain on a continent that's obscure to African Americans, that they don't feel a part of, that they feel separate from, that they feel a completely different experience from. But if we're learning at the same time that we're experiencing the same things, whether here in America or there on the continent, then it could create bonds. It could create bonds just based alone on what you would call similar experiences. And we can begin to start a conversation. Well, what was that like for you there, knowing that you were going through the same thing on the continent that we were going through here in the Americas? That they had to desegregate things, that they had to protest for equal rights and equal opportunities during the colonial era, right? As we had to do during the Jim Crow era. So right there's common ground to start discussions.
So it sounds like we may need to broaden the work that's going on in the summer program with our Racial Equity Institute. But for right now, I want to toss to some work that was done earlier this summer with our students. And we spoke to some of the youth who participated in that CSC-funded Racial Equity Institute workshop at the Old Dillard Museum. It was interesting to hear their take on the importance of the historical knowledge, and as they too join us on this journey to dismantle racism.
What was most interesting was probably like really defining the definition of racism. When we watched the video about the different races and the bicycle, how if you were African American, they treated you differently and they wanted to call 911 versus if you were white, they were willing to help you steal the bike. I see it playing a role by informing my bandmates about this and also spreading knowledge.
It really changed my view on the way that, society and how it's changed, and the way that things used to be to how they are now. Some of the specific concepts were the fact that race is said to be just an idea. Something that's very important is that whenever someone brings up the topic of race or equality, something that I would do personally is try and explain to them what's really going on, so there's no misunderstanding or anything false. They deserve to know the truth. We all deserve to know the truth as Americans.
It seemed like it was nothing major, but I like took it really far in my mind. Was the whole knowing that your brain has like a system 1 and a system 2. Like your system 1 is the things that just happen at the top of your head. Like you don't even got to think about it. Like breathing is for example. And then your system 2, like that's something, oh, you got to think about what you do before you just act. Like that's really deep. Cause you can't really just judge judging someone is something that you just do. You don't think about what you finna say before you say it. And like that's really big. I wouldn't say it really challenged me, but it surprised me that people were out there willing to talk about the things that not other people will talk about. Like people think about race and it's like, oh, they don't want to say nothing about it because they don't want to offend people. But I feel like you don't really offend somebody until you ask them, is it offensive? The Old Building Museum 1, honestly, I didn't even know it was here myself until this workshop began. So like, knowing that there's so much history about a place and like not many people know about it, well, many people in my age group, it gives me like, dang, we should really do something to like be able to get the word out and have more people know about it.
It really shocked me that they invented this whole race and how they actually invented the white race too. How can you look at a person and just think that they're inferior to you? That really shocked me. Most people don't know what race is, how it actually came to be, why it actually came to be, why people have that closed mindset.
The whole idea of race and the fact that there are many systems of oppressions that are coming towards us, and the fact that when we start one or stop one, another one just comes in. Like we stopped segregation, then mass incarceration and modern slavery just stepped in. I look up to people like Martin Luther King and watch people like Oprah Winfrey, you know, African American influencers and activists, pretty much people like those. And then they pretty much showed me that we could still make a difference throughout all of this.
So one of the challenges I faced, like I didn't know actually, was that like one of the requirements to being a citizen when America was first started was that you had to be white. Well, I feel as if when I began my career in law enforcement, I feel as if like I don't want to actually be color blind, but I actually want to be color aware and like how to handle different situations for different races. One of the first principals in Broward County was also his wife was the founder of my current school, Blanche Ely. So that was a pretty fun fact I didn't know, and also that like blacks were one of the founders of basically modern music to this day. Like for example, jazz.
It's so wonderful to see those young people get excited and passionate about their future and how they are going to help bring racial equity and healing to the world. So we only have a few minutes left, but I'd really like to hear from each of you what your message is to our audience today about the history of the Black people, of race relations in this county, and how they can get engaged. Hojo, how about we start with you?
With me, it comes back to roots, reconnecting with roots. So I have a full understanding that the African American experience is real, and that there are many African Americans who say that they are rooted in this country, and they are. But what we need to understand even more importantly is that the African American is a branch from the original tree of African people. So yes, you can lop off a branch and bring it somewhere else and develop roots. You can replant it, but it is important to eventually reconnect with the original tree, and that original tree is found on the continent. And a lot of relationships are beginning to open up now, particularly, and I can say from recent experience in Ghana, which is welcoming and opening of arms and making the visa process quite simple, and just prepared to reconcile the history between the two continents. And another point that I wanted to make is, if you are speaking to someone, particularly of African descent or of any so-called race, and you're aware that they have acute amnesia, what would your feeling be towards that person? I know that if I met someone who was sick, I would want them to be healed. I would want them to be whole. So therefore, if I know that I'm speaking to someone who has amnesia, whether it's their fault or not, a wish that I would have for them is for them to be healed, for their amnesia to be cured.
That is very powerful.
Yeah, and we have all the tools to cure that amnesia. We have all the resources. We have all the writing. It's all available. So now we just need the will.
Very powerful.
Yeah.
Mrs. Mizell?
There is a group called the Trailblazers, and it is the Trailblazers' function to educate the youth in Broward County, let them know their history, or people that not even aware of their history. You don't necessarily have to be the youth. But we meet in that same building that the kids were in, the Dillard Museum. Did you know that? Well, and I was just sitting here thinking that would be a great thing if the kids wanted to know more about what went on in Broward County with kids or with even adults during the deep segregation era, that the Trailblazers would be a good vessel. And it doesn't have to be Black History Month, but I had brought this up to the Trailblazers at one time, that we could, I don't like the idea that 1 month is designated to you finding out about blacks, but
Right.
there's that February thing, you know. But we could go into the schools with a program that would really go deep into teaching them about their roots all the way back to Africa. And that's where we should start, and letting them be more aware of their culture. Just for 1 month, if we could go to as many elementary, I think we should start with elementary or middle, and that's what I think we should do, educate the young people more.
Well, you're saying it in front of the right person. So David, what's your closing thought? You ready to bring it to the elementary schools?
Yes, and the state of Florida mandates that African American history and contributions of African Americans is infused in all content areas and all grade levels. And so we're excited that our Broward County School Board and our superintendent have supported initiatives to have more students take tours and go to visit some of our African American museums that are in Pompano Beach, in Fort Lauderdale, in South Broward and the Hallandale area, and really get to learn the rich history and culture and the African American experience and African diaspora across the district. So the last piece that I'll share is one of the visions of our school district, our school board and our superintendent, is to increase the number of African American course offerings at the high school level and resources at the middle and elementary level, so that more teachers will have the tools they need to support these types of initiatives.
It's fantastic. And I know I've taken advantage of the Trailblazers. We've had them, some members come to our office and speak to us about the history, and it's been really enlightening. Thank you so much. I think it's fair to say that in our culture, history is not regarded with the importance that it deserves. If we're to glean its lessons and use that knowledge to move forward toward a more equitable future. I want to thank David Watkins, Lorraine Mizell, and Shaba Kojo for their insights and contributions to this journey. I've been your host, Cindy Arenberg-Seltzer. For this or any other episode of Future First, focus on Broward's children, go to our website, cscbroward.org, where you can access our YouTube channel, follow us on social media, and remember to join us next time on Future First, focus on Broward's children.